8 kernels, 800 kernels, 1 grass, 9,000 years. This is not a story about farming. This is a story about genetic engineering. And the engineers have never once been given credit. In 7000 BCE, indigenous cultivators in one valley, in what is now Mexico, changed every meal on Earth. Western science would spend the next 9,000 years catching up to what they already knew. Hold 2 objects in your mind right now. First object, a wild teosinte spike, dry and brittle, barely the length of your finger. Its kernels between 5 and 12 are locked in shells, harder than a fingernail, the color of dark obsidian. You cannot eat them, not without breaking your teeth. Second object, a modern Oaxacan landrace, maize ear, golden and heavy, 800 kernels exposed to open air. These 2 objects share 5 regulatory genes. 5 genes, 9,000 years. 1 valley. The space between teosinte and modern corn is not a natural accident. It is the longest continuous science experiment in human history. And no textbook tells you who ran it. To understand what happened, you need to place yourself in the Balsas River Valley, Guerrero, and Oaxaca, southern Mexico. The year is approximately 7000 BCE, 9,000 years ago. There are no universities here, no written genetic theory, no Mendel, no microscope. What there is, generations of Zapotec and Mixtec ancestors watching a grass, season after season, deciding which seeds to keep. That grass is Teosinte zea, maize subspecies parviglumis, for anyone taking notes. It is not impressive to look at. It grows wild along riverbanks, a weedy grass, among other weedy grasses. Its spike shatters when it dries, scattering those hard little kernels across the ground. That shattering is the plant's survival mechanism. It seeds itself. It does not need humans. But someone looked at that unimpressive grass and made a counterintuitive decision. They selected against the shattering. They kept the seeds that stayed on the stalk, the seeds that could not seed themselves. In doing so, they began a transaction that would reshape the planet. The plant became dependent on human hands to reproduce. And humans became dependent on the plant for calories. A 9,000-year partnership made in one river valley by one group of people. Now let us set up the comparison that makes this story impossible to look away from. This is a side-by-side. On the left side of the screen, the teosinte to maize transformation, Balsas Valley, 7000 BCE forward. On the right side, every major chapter of Western crop science, from wild einkorn wheat to modern GMO development. We are going to run these 2 timelines at the same time, and what you are about to see will not leave you. Left side, 7000 BCE, Zapotec and Mixtec cultivators in the Balsas Valley begin selecting teosinte seeds. No theory, no written record, observation, memory, and the accumulated knowledge passed between generations. The smell of that river valley, humid, green, the heavy mineral weight of wet clay soil, is the lab where this work begins. Right side, 7000 BCE, wild einkorn wheat grows uncultivated across the Fertile Crescent. Nobody is selecting it yet. Both timelines start in the same century. Now watch what they do differently. Left side, 3000 BCE, 4,000 years of continuous selection have passed. Maize cobs excavated at Gila Naquit's cave in Oaxaca show measurable increases in cob size over wild teosinte. 4,000 years of work, and you can see it in the physical record. Bigger cobs, more kernels, softer shells. Right side, 3000 BCE. Einkorn wheat is being cultivated across the Fertile Crescent and early Europe. The morphological distance between wild einkorn and cultivated einkorn at this point is measurable, but modest. The grain is recognizably related to its wild ancestor. Here is the first split in the comparison. The maize transformation is already more visibly transformed than anything wheat breeders have achieved, and the gap will only widen. The evidence of this 4,000-year breeding project sits in physical form in Oaxacan soil. Archaeologists found those cobs. They measured them. Left side, 1000 BCE. Domesticated maize reaches what is now the southwestern United States. Ancestral Puebloan cultivators begin adapting it to arid, high-altitude desert conditions. This is a secondary engineering achievement entirely distinct from the original Balsas Valley domestication. The same genetic lineage bred by different indigenous hands, reshaping itself for a completely different environment. Right side. 1000 BCE, European bred wheat is spreading across the continent. It is a genuinely impressive crop, but the visual distance between wild einkorn and bred wheat, while real, remains far smaller than the teosint to maize gap. A botanist in 1000 BCE could look at wild einkorn and bred wheat and understand the relationship. No botanist in 1000 BCE could look at a teosint spike and modern maize and believe they were the same plant. That is the measure of the achievement. Let us stop here and name what is happening on the left side of this screen. The Zapotec and Mixtec peoples of Oaxaca are not just growing a food crop. For these communities, maize is a cosmological and civic identity. The Zapotec agricultural calendar, how the year is organized, how governance decisions are made, how community life flows is structured around maize cultivation cycles. This is an unbroken line from the original domestication event in the Balsas Valley to today. The crop and the culture are the same document. No written notes, no laboratory freezer, memory is the archive. And the archive never failed. Left side. Continuing forward. The maize transformation has now involved changes to approximately 5 major regulatory genes. 5, not 50, not 500. At that scale, rewriting 5 sentences in a 30,000-page encyclopedia changes less text than this alteration did, but the plant became unrecognizable. 8 to 12 kernels locked in stone-hard shells on a brittle grass spike, versus 800 kernels, soft and starchy, exposed on a cob that cannot survive without human hands. The difference between a single-car garage and a 100-unit apartment building built by selecting seeds, not drawing architectural plans. Right side. European agricultural science is making real progress on wheat, rye, barley. These are genuine achievements. Do not misread this comparison as dismissal. But none of these crops required breeders to simultaneously work against the plant's own survival instinct. Teosinte wanted to shatter and self-seed. Zapotec and Mixtec breeders selected that mechanism out of existence. That specific counterintuitive move, removing the plant's ability to survive without you, has no parallel in Old World crop development. Now, here is where the right side of our timeline makes its most important entry. 1866. Gregor Mendel publishes his Laws of Hereditary Inheritance. This is the founding document of Western genetic science. It is also approximately 8,866 years after cultivators in the Balsas Valley began performing the practical work Mendel was theorizing. 8,800 years. Mendel was not discovering something new. He was writing the manual for a machine that had been running for 90 centuries. But what happened next, nobody teaches this part. Left side. 1893. The World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago puts a maize display on international view. Hundreds of varieties, collected from across the Americas. Western agricultural scientists look at this display and see a remarkable crop. What they do not ask, not yet, not seriously, is where it came from. Right side. Western botany is now a professionalized academic discipline with journals, universities, and international conferences. It has developed sophisticated tools for tracing crop lineages, and it has spent 400 years since Columbus returned from the Caribbean with maize specimens in 1493, failing to explain what maize actually is. European agronomists, encountering maize for the first time in 1493, had no framework that could account for it. No Old World crop looked like this. No wild relative was obvious. They assumed someone must have already done the hard work. They just did not ask who. Left side. 1939. George Beadle, a Western scientist, formally publishes the hypothesis that teosint is the wild ancestor of maize. The Western plant establishment largely rejects it. The formal scientific objection was essentially this: it is impossible that a grass with 5 to 12 kernels per spike became a cob bearing 800 kernels. The transformation is too extreme. There must be another explanation. Right side. 1939. Western science has now had 446 years to study maize since Columbus brought samples to Spain. It has produced no consensus answer on maize's origin. And rather than looking to the people who had cultivated it for 9 millennia, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, the descendants of the Balsas Valley cultivators, Western botany looked at its own doubts. The Zapotec oral histories said otherwise. They had always said otherwise. The knowledge was never lost. It simply was not being asked for. Here is where the evidence gets harder to ignore. Left side. The 1990s through 2004, molecular genetics arrives. John Dobley begins the genetic analysis that will finally map the teosint to maize transformation at the molecular level. Right side. Simultaneously, the GMO era begins. In 1994, the Flavor Savor tomato becomes the first commercially sold genetically modified food crop in the United States. The scientific and media coverage is extensive. Headlines describe it as a revolutionary act of human engineering, modifying a plant's genetics to change its characteristics. This is the comparison that reframes everything. The Flavor Savor tomato modification involves suppressing one gene to slow softening. One gene, one trait, modified in a university laboratory with electron microscopes and gene sequencing equipment. The international scientific and food industry establishments celebrated this as a milestone in human capability. The teosint to maize transformation involved precisely targeted changes across 5 major regulatory gene loci, achieved without a single piece of laboratory equipment. Over 9,000 years of field-based selection by Zapotec and Mixtec peoples in the Balsas Valley. The result was not a slightly firmer tomato. The result was the most widely grown crop on Earth. This is the comparison nobody draws in the GMO debate, and it should be the first thing said. Modern genetic engineering and ancient indigenous breeding are parallel processes. Both manipulate genetic expression. Both target specific traits. Both transform a plant's phenotype through deliberate human intervention. The difference is the tools and the timeline. And one of them, the 9,000-year version, produced a result so extreme that modern science spent 60 years denying it had happened at all. Dobley's work, published in a landmark review in 2004, mapped the mechanism precisely. 5 major regulatory loci, not hundreds of small mutations drifting randomly through the genome. Regulatory genes, genes that control how other genes are expressed. Zapotec and Mixtec breeders, selecting seeds by eye and hand over 300 generations, had hit the precise leverage points in the genome, not adjacent to them, not near them, the exact loci. Western molecular science needed electron microscopes and gene sequencers to find those loci. Balsas Valley cultivators found them with their hands, their memory, and their seeds. That is the scale of patience this work required. Not genius in a flash. Genius across lifetimes. 2002, Matsuoka and colleagues publish in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Multilocus microsatellite genotyping. The full molecular picture. Result: a single domestication origin for all modern maize worldwide. One location: the Balsas River Valley. One people, the ancestors of the Zapotec and Mixtec communities of Oaxaca and Guerrero. Not multiple independent domestications, not a European contribution, not a colonial refinement. One valley, one unbroken knowledge chain. Every ear of corn on earth, every ear, every corn syrup, every tortilla, every cornfield in Iowa. Same genetic signature, same valley, same people. Right side of the timeline, 2002, the same year Matsuoka's paper is published. The GMO industry is producing crops engineered to resist specific herbicides, express insect-resistant proteins, and survive drought. These are significant technical achievements requiring billions of dollars of infrastructure. The comparison is not that one is better than the other. The comparison is about credit, attribution, and the question of whose engineering gets called engineering. Modern GMO development is universally credited to its developers, specific companies, specific scientists, specific patent holders. The most consequential act of plant genetic engineering in human history, teosinte, to modern maize, is credited to no one. It appears in most textbooks as a passive event. Maize was domesticated. Subject, absent. Let us make the scale concrete in a way that does not let you look away. Maize is currently grown on approximately 197 million hectares worldwide as of 2022 FAO data. 197 million hectares is larger than the entire country of Mexico, which covers 196.4 million hectares, an area larger than Mexico itself, covered in a single crop every hectare, descended from one valley inside Mexico, from one people who live there still. And the breeding program that produced it lasted 9,000 years longer than the entire written history of every European civilization combined by approximately 4,000 years. The most revealing part of this story is still ahead, because here is what happened to the knowledge itself. Colonization did not just displace people. It attempted to sever the living connection between Zapotec and Mixtec communities and their maize lineage. The introduction of industrial hybrid corn varieties into Oaxacan agricultural systems in the 20th century was presented as modernization. It was, in practice, a replacement of 9,000 years of regionally adapted genetic diversity with a narrower industrial genome. Industrial hybrid corn cannot reproduce true from its own seed. Farmers must buy new seed each season. The Balsas Valley cultivators had spent 9,000 years building seed sovereignty into the plant itself. Industrial hybridization reversed that in one generation. But the Zapotec community response to this is the part of the story that reframes everything about survival. Currently, Oaxacan communities maintain approximately 35 distinct landrace varieties of maize as active food sovereignty practice. 35, not museum pieces, not frozen seed bank samples, locked in Norwegian vaults. Living crops, grown in living milpa systems, by living farmers, whose agricultural knowledge descends in an unbroken line from the original domestication event. Each of those 35 landraces represents centuries of additional selective breeding layered on top of the 9,000-year foundation. Each one is a different chapter of the same science. This is the living inheritance that Crystal Wahpepah is working with in Oakland, California. Wahpepah is Kickapoo Nation of Oklahoma. She opened Wahpepah's Kitchen in Oakland in 2022. She sources heritage corn varieties, specifically from indigenous farmers, not as a nostalgic gesture, as a deliberate, commercial act of reclaiming the maize domestication lineage in urban native foodways. The menu at Wahpepah's Kitchen is a living document of the breeding science that Western botany spent 60 years denying. And in Minneapolis, Sean Sherman, Oglala Lakota, has said something that needs to be at the center of this conversation. In his own words, from his book, The Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, "Our foods are medicines. Our foods are who we are. When you take away someone's food, you take away their identity." That statement is not metaphor. It is a precise description of what colonization used food removal to accomplish. And it is equally a precise description of what food reclamation reverses. Here is the comparison that this whole video has been building toward. On the right side of our split screen, Western genetic science, from Mendel in 1866 to Dobley in 2004. 138 years of formal theoretical development, culminating in the ability to sequence and map the maize genome. On the left side, 9,000 years of practical genetic engineering, completed before Western science had a single theoretical framework to explain it. When Dobley published his 2004 review identifying the 5 regulatory genes of maize domestication, he was describing work that had been finished for approximately 8,900 years. That is not a gap in indigenous knowledge. That is a gap in Western understanding. Now let us run the comparison to its modern conclusion. Right side, 2024. The GMO industry is worth approximately $36 billion annually. It is legally protected by international patent frameworks. Its developers are named. Its intellectual property is owned. The science behind it is taught in every agricultural university on Earth. Left side, 2024. The foundational science that made the modern corn industry possible, the 9,000-year teosint breeding program, is not patented. It is not taught as science in most agricultural curricula. The people who developed it, Zapotec and Mixtec descendants in Oaxaca, received no royalties from the 197 million hectares of their crop currently under cultivation worldwide. That asymmetry is not an oversight. It is a policy outcome, reproduced in every generation since Columbus carried maize samples to Spain in 1493. But here is where the story does something unusual. It does not end in loss, because the knowledge was never actually lost. That is the most important line in this entire video. In 2002, when Matsuoka's molecular genetics paper confirmed a single Balsas Valley origin for all maize, it confirmed what Zapotec oral history had maintained continuously for 9,000 years. Western science needed DNA sequencing. Zapotec oral tradition needed nothing except the commitment to remember. Both arrived at the same answer. One of them was working from a 90-century head start. The metaphor that fits this story precisely is this. Domesticating teosinte into modern maize is the equivalent of taking a bicycle and without blueprints, without a university, without writing down a single formula, engineering a commercial jet over 300 generations, and then having the Western world spend 400 years insisting you must have had help, or been lucky, or that maybe the jet had always existed. That is what the plant establishment's rejection of Beetle's 1939 hypothesis actually was. Not scientific skepticism, institutional inability to credit indigenous work as science. There is a reason Western botanists in the 1930s and 40s formally doubted teosinte was the ancestor. The transformation was so extreme, it sat outside their existing framework for what selective breeding could accomplish. Their framework was built on European crop development, wheat, barley, rye, where the wild ancestor and the domestic crop remain visually recognizable relatives. Teosinte and maize do not look like relatives. They look like completely different plants. That is precisely the measure of how far beyond European agricultural precedent the Balsas Valley breeding program had gone. The achievement was so large, it looked impossible. And when something looks impossible, one response is to conclude it never happened. The other response is to ask, who made it possible? Indigenous food sovereignty organizations are now asking that question and answering it in practical terms. The Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative works with Native nations to assert legal and economic frameworks around traditional agricultural knowledge. This includes heritage corn varieties, whose drought-resistance traits bred into specific landraces over centuries of cultivation in water-stressed environments are increasingly valuable as industrial monoculture. Corn faces climate volatility. The 35 Oaxacan landrace varieties maintained by Zapotec communities are not relics. They are the most climate-adapted corn genetics on Earth, because they were bred by people who lived in drought conditions for millennia and selected for survival without irrigation infrastructure. Crystal Wahpepah, in interviews following her restaurant's 2022 opening, said she sources indigenous-grown heritage corn precisely because of this resilience. The seed is not nostalgic, the seed is forward-facing. It carries traits that industrial hybrid corn, bred for yield under irrigated conditions, has lost. The 9,000-year breeding program is not only history. It is active climate adaptation infrastructure, held in seed form by Zapotec and Mixtec farmers right now. Left side, 9,000 years of continuous Zapotec and Mixtec agricultural science in the Balsas Valley and across Oaxaca. Right side, from Mendel's peas in 1866 to CRISPR gene editing in 2012, 146 years of formal Western genetic science. These two timelines are not opposites. They are the same discipline operating across different timescales, with different tools, and with radically different systems of attribution. The comparison does not diminish Western genetic science. It contextualizes it and refuses to let the longer, larger science remain nameless. Every corn tortilla you have ever eaten carries a genetic signature. That signature traces to one river valley in what is now Mexico, to one people Zapotec and Mixtec ancestors in the Balsas Valley, to one unbroken chain of knowledge that survived 9,000 years, colonization, the introduction of industrial hybrids, and 4 centuries of Western plant confusion. When Wahpepah's kitchen sources heritage corn from indigenous farmers, it is exercising custody of a food science that was never surrendered. It was simply never acknowledged. Sean Sherman's words carry the full weight of this history. Our foods are medicines. Our foods are who we are. When you take away someone's food, you take away their identity. That identity was encoded in 5 regulatory genes, selected across 300 generations in a humid valley in southern Mexico, by people whose descendants are still here, still farming, still selecting, still running the longest science experiment in human history. The Western GMO era is 30 years old. The Zapotec and Mixtec maize domestication project is 9,000 years old. Both are genetic engineering. One of them feeds more people than any other crop on Earth. One of them has a patent. These are not the same one. The grass that could not survive without human hands made a world that cannot eat without it. And the hands that built that world are still in the field farming seeds that carry 9,000 years of unpatented genius into the next drought, the next season, the next generation. The seed is not nostalgic. The seed is forward-facing. It carries traits that industrial hybrid corn, bred for yield under irrigated conditions, has lost. The 9,000-year breeding program is not only history, it is active climate adaptation infrastructure, held in seed form by indigenous farmers right now. Let us return to the split screen one final time. Left side, 9,000 years of continuous Zapotec and Mixtec agricultural science in the Balsas Valley and across Oaxaca. We just had to look at both sides of the screen at the same time. If this comparison shifted something for you, if it changed how you think about the word engineering, share this video with one person who eats corn. That is, everyone. So share it with everyone. The next video in this series looks at another ingredient whose origin is attributed to the wrong civilization. Subscribe, and do not let that one pass you. The grass that shouldn't exist made a world that cannot exist without it. And the hands that made it deserve to be in the history books they built.